I came home from an electrical job to find bulldozers crushing my son's therapy garden, and when I confronted the HOA president about destroying 3 years of my autistic child's progress, she smiled and said it was just business. But what she didn't know was that I'd spent 2 decades documenting everything, and I was about to turn her arrogance into a federal case that would destroy her completely. My name is James Chen, I'm 51 years old, and this is the story of how a working-class electrician defeated a corrupt real estate developer who thought money and connections put her above the law. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Before we start, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? And what's your HOA horror story? Let's jump into today's episode. 3 years ago, my wife Rebecca died suddenly from an aneurysm. One moment, we were having coffee on a Saturday morning. The next moment, I was in an emergency room watching doctors tell me there was nothing they could do. Rebecca was 48 years old. Our son Marcus was 9 years old, and he stopped speaking after she died. The doctors said it was trauma-induced selective mutism, a psychological shutdown where grief literally sealed his voice. For 6 months, Marcus didn't say a single word. He'd point at things, nod or shake his head, but his voice was completely gone. The school psychologist recommended something called a therapeutic sensory garden. The idea was that a dedicated outdoor space with different textures, sounds, and smells could help Marcus reconnect with the world without pressure to speak. Rebecca's mother helped me plan it, and I spent that entire spring building something special. I laid river stone pathways, installed jasmine vines that smelled incredible in the evening, planted lavender and mint, built tactile walls with different textures, and hung wind chimes that created gentle sounds when the breeze moved through. I wanted that garden to be a sanctuary where my son could heal at his own pace without anyone expecting anything from him. It took 3 months to complete, and the transformation in Marcus was remarkable. He'd sit out there for hours in the afternoon sun, sometimes just touching different plants and textures, sometimes lying in the grass watching clouds move across the sky. About 6 months after I finished building it, Marcus said his first word in months. He'd come inside and just point at the garden and say, "Pretty." One word, but it meant everything. That simple word told me my son was coming back to life. Over the next 2 years, Marcus gradually began speaking more, first in the garden with just me and his therapist, then at school, then with other kids. That garden saved my son's life, and it meant more to me than any amount of money. Then Mark Richardson became HOA president, and everything changed. Mark was 58 years old, an MBA from Duke, a real estate developer who'd made millions building commercial properties throughout the Southeast. He'd moved to Pinewood Valley Estates about 5 years earlier, bought the biggest house on the nicest street, and immediately started talking about transforming the neighborhood into something more profitable and prestigious. The problem was that Pinewood Valley's deed restrictions, written in 1987, explicitly prohibited commercial development. Our community was designed as a residential neighborhood, and those restrictions existed to protect property values and community character. But Mark had a different vision. He wanted to build a commercial retail center with restaurants and shops. He wanted a fitness facility. He wanted an office complex. He wanted parking structures and mixed-use developments. And he wanted to do it all on land that was legally restricted from commercial use. Most people would have accepted that limitation and moved on to another project. Mark Richardson was not most people. Mark decided that old deed restrictions were just obstacles to be overcome by someone with enough confidence and enough money to ignore them. The first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday in March. My beautiful therapeutic garden, which my son depended on for his emotional well-being, was suddenly an unauthorized landscaping modification. According to Mark's interpretation of the HOA bylaws, I needed written approval from the Architectural Committee for any landscaping changes. I had not sought that approval. Therefore, I was in violation. The fine was $300 per month until the garden was removed. I called the HOA office that afternoon and asked to see the specific deed restriction that my garden violated. The receptionist, a nice woman named Christine, who'd always been friendly, suddenly became evasive. "I'll have to check with Mark," she said, and I could hear the nervousness in her voice. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. This was about power. This was about a wealthy developer who decided that an electrician and his autistic son weren't important enough to stand in his way. Mark called me that evening, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of someone who'd talked his way out of difficult situations before. "James, I respect what you're doing with your son. The garden is very nice, but we need consistency throughout the community. What if everyone started planting whatever they wanted? We'd have chaos, we'd have no standards, we'd have a neighborhood that no one wanted to live in." He said it like he was explaining something simple to a child, like I should be grateful for his patient instruction. I told him I had the deed documentation right in front of me, and the restrictions actually allowed residential landscaping modifications up to 30% of lot size. My garden covered 8%. It was legal. I had the proof. There was a long pause on the phone, and when Mark spoke again, his voice had lost some of its smoothness. "James, these old deeds aren't really enforceable in modern development context. We're moving forward with community improvement initiatives, and frankly, your garden is in the way of our vision for Pinewood Valley's future." That's when I knew exactly what was happening. Mark Richardson was going to systematically destroy anything that stood between him and his commercial development plans. And my son's therapeutic garden, the thing that had brought Marcus back from the edge of psychological destruction, was his first target. I hung up the phone and walked out to that garden. Marcus was sitting by the jasmine vines, touching the leaves the way he always did, and I made a decision right there. This man was going to learn that some people don't back down when their children's well-being is at stake. I pulled out my professional camera, the one I'd used for 22 years documenting electrical work, and I started photographing that garden from every angle. Every plant, every pathway, every detail, and then I went inside and started researching Mark Richardson. What I discovered about Mark Richardson in the next 48 hours should have shocked me, but honestly, it confirmed every suspicion I'd developed during that phone call. This man didn't just bend rules, he systematically violated them, and he'd been doing it for years. I spent that entire night on the county assessor's website, looking at building permits and property records for every development Mark had ever touched. Every single one had violations. Zoning overages, height restriction violations, setback requirement issues, parking calculation problems. But somehow, mysteriously, every single one had been approved anyway. How did a developer consistently get buildings approved when they violated multiple codes? The answer was always the same: connections. Building inspectors who looked the other way, city council members who voted for variances without proper justification, county officials who approved permits with rubber stamps instead of scrutiny. But the real story wasn't just about violations. The real story was about money. I requested copies of the Pinewood Valley HOA financial statements, exercising my legal right as a unit owner to review community finances. The HOA office sent back a letter saying records were unavailable because they were being organized for archival purposes. I called the North Carolina Attorney General's office and explained that the HOA was refusing to provide statutorily required financial disclosures. 2 weeks later, I received 8 years of complete financial statements in a single FedEx box. What I found in those statements made my hands literally shake. There was a shell company called Community Enhancement LLC that had been receiving payments from the Pinewood Valley HOA for something mysteriously labeled architectural consulting fees. Between 2018 and 2023, Community Enhancement LLC received exactly $340,000 from our community fund. I did some research and discovered that Community Enhancement LLC was registered to a business address that turned out to be a mail drop. I paid for a corporate record search and found that the company's sole owner was Mark Richardson's wife, Sharon. So Mark had been funneling HOA funds into a company he controlled through his spouse. The money was allegedly for architectural consulting, but I couldn't find a single architectural consulting service actually performed. There were no designs, no plans, no deliverables, nothing except checks being written from our community fund to Mark's wife's company. I hired an accountant named David Liu to do a proper forensic audit. David was retired from a major firm and did consulting work for people in situations like mine. He spent 4 days going through every financial statement, every check register, every bank reconciliation. Then he sat down in my kitchen on a Thursday evening and spread the evidence across my dining room table like he was dealing with cards in a high-stakes poker game. "James," he said, not making eye contact, "what you have here is textbook embezzlement. The financial trail is so clear and obvious that it almost seems intentional, like he wanted to get caught." I asked him how much money we were actually talking about. David pointed to his summary sheet, and the number next to total identified misappropriation was $340,000. Mark Richardson had stolen $340,000 from 287 families over 5 years. He'd done it by creating a fake consulting company, funneling community money into it, and then using that money to finance development projects that would increase his own property value and business portfolio. The genius of his scheme was that it was so brazen and so obvious that most people would assume the HOA board must be aware of it. Most people wouldn't think someone could be this criminally stupid. But Mark had 3 advantages. He'd installed allies on the board, he'd convinced people he was too educated and too successful to be a criminal, and he'd counted on working-class residents like me being too intimidated to actually verify anything. I brought everything to my friend Sarah Martinez, who'd been a sheriff's detective for 15 years and lived 2 blocks away. Sarah reviewed the documents spread across my dining room table, and her expression went from skeptical to furious in about 90 seconds. "This is federal," she said. "If any of these bank transfers crossed state lines, this becomes wire fraud. And mark my words, someone this careless has definitely used interstate banking." She connected me with Special Agent Kenneth Moore from the FBI's Charlotte field office. Kenneth specialized in homeowners association fraud and had prosecuted 47 cases over his career. Kenneth was a tall African-American man in his early 50s, wearing a gray suit and an expression of professional skepticism. He reviewed my documentation methodically, not reacting much until he reached the bank records. Then he looked up. "Mr. Chen, most embezzlers try to hide their crimes. This man created a paper trail you could drive a truck through. Either he's monumentally stupid, or he believed his power was absolute." Kenneth explained that federal wire fraud requires only that fraudulent transactions cross state lines, and given that Mark's company had received payments through a bank in Charlotte while sending funds to accounts in multiple states, there was clear federal jurisdiction. This wasn't just a case for local prosecutors. This was a federal crime, which meant Mark Richardson's MBA and country club connections wouldn't save him. Kenneth started the investigation immediately. He contacted the FBI Financial Crimes Unit and obtained subpoenas for all of Mark's banking records, his company records, and his phone and email communications. He assigned 2 agents to investigate the shell company and its connections to Mark's other developments. And he told me something that changed everything. "Don't tell anyone what you know. Don't confront Mark. Just act normal and let us build the case." But Mark Richardson wasn't stupid about everything, and he had one crucial skill that made him genuinely dangerous. He could read people. He knew within about 2 weeks that something was wrong. I don't know if he sensed that I'd been researching him, or if he'd noticed me photographing my property, or if he'd simply recognized the pattern of investigation that he'd probably seen directed at him before. Whatever it was, Mark shifted his strategy from trying to intimidate me into compliance to trying to destroy me socially and professionally. The escalation began on a Friday morning when I found 3 violation notices taped to my front door. The first citation was for commercial equipment in residential area, my electrical contractor truck, which I'd been parking in my driveway for 15 years without a single complaint. The second was for unapproved landscape modifications, my son's therapy garden. The third was for unlicensed outbuilding, my tool shed, which I'd built exactly to code and exactly in compliance with all setback requirements. Each violation carried a fine of $200 per day. The fines would accumulate until I either paid them or removed the violations. Given that the violations were either legal or essential to my business and my son's well-being, I had no option except to let the fines accumulate. Within 2 weeks, the fines totaled $2,800. Within 4 weeks, they'd reached $5,600. I called the county building inspector to ask whether my truck actually violated any city ordinances. The inspector's office told me that commercial vehicles were allowed in residential areas as long as the owner lived at that address and the vehicle was registered to that address. Both conditions were met. I was legal. When I asked the HOA to remove the violations based on that clarification, Mark responded by adding 5 more violations to my property. But the fines were just the opening move in a much larger campaign. The real attack came from a different direction. Marcus came home from school on a Tuesday afternoon with red eyes and wouldn't talk about what happened, which, given his history of selective mutism, was a serious warning sign. I finally got him to explain that a girl named Brittany in his class had announced to the entire lunch table that my family was terrible people and that I was trying to steal money from the HOA. Brittany's mother was part of Mark's inner circle. Someone I later found out was the wife of the board secretary. The social warfare had begun. Over the next 3 weeks, I started noticing subtle changes in how neighbors interacted with me. People who used to wave would suddenly be very interested in their phones when I drove past. A neighbor I'd known for 5 years crossed the street to avoid me at the grocery store. Emma, Marcus's older sister, reported that parents were telling their kids not to hang out with her family. Someone at the gym where I worked out suggested that maybe I should reconsider my membership. The message was clear. Mark had weaponized the entire community against me. Then Mark called an emergency HOA meeting. He stood in front of about 90 residents in our community center, looking genuinely concerned, and told them that I'd been making false accusations against the HOA as part of a scheme to extort settlement money. He said I was a disgruntled contractor who'd been refused approval for some personal project and was retaliating by making up financial crimes that had no basis in reality. He said the HOA had consulted with a lawyer who assured them that my claims were baseless. He said he was concerned about my mental state and suggested that grief over my wife's death might be affecting my judgment. Standing there in his tailored suit, speaking with the practiced confidence of someone who'd convinced boards and city councils for decades, Mark was genuinely convincing. I watched faces in that room shift from sympathy to suspicion. He'd just spent 15 minutes making me sound like a crazy widower trying to destroy his community out of spite. And he'd done it without saying anything that was technically false. That was the genius of Mark Richardson. He didn't need to lie. He just needed to reframe the truth in a way that made me sound unreliable. One of my oldest neighbors, Linda Patel, whose house I'd rewired 5 years earlier, pulled me aside after the meeting. "James, is any of this true? Are you actually trying to sue?" I explained that Mark had stolen from the community and that I was asking the authorities to investigate. I told her I had financial documentation proving the embezzlement. I asked her to request the HOA financial statements herself and verify whether Mark's explanation made sense. 3 days later, Linda came to my house furious. Mark had refused to provide her with the financial documentation, claiming it was confidential HOA business. Linda, a retired accountant, recognized that refusal for exactly what it was: consciousness of guilt. But Linda was one person. The rest of the community had already decided I was the problem. School administrators started questioning Marcus about our family situation. A parent complained that my electrical truck was an eyesore affecting her property values. Mark began showing up at every community event, making subtle comments about certain residents who weren't aligned with community values. Then came the moment that almost broke me. Marcus came home from school, went straight to his room, and refused to come out for dinner. When I finally got him to talk to me, he said that his best friend's mother had told that friend he couldn't hang out with Marcus anymore because Marcus's father was causing problems. My son, who had fought so hard to overcome his trauma and learn to speak, to make friends, to become confident, that boy was being destroyed by Mark's campaign against me. I sat in that destroyed garden one evening, looking at the empty soil where the jasmine had been ripped out, and I almost gave up. I had the phone number of Mark's lawyer on my desk. I was one phone call away from accepting a settlement, moving my family somewhere else and trying to start over. My son's well-being was deteriorating. My business was suffering. My neighbors had turned against me. The financial fines were accumulating. Everything was crushing down on me at once. Then my phone rang. Special Agent Kenneth Moore's voice was calm and professional, which somehow made the news even more significant. Mr. Chen, a federal grand jury has just issued an indictment against Mark Richardson for wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. We're executing search warrants at his residence and his business office at 2 p.m. today. I'm asking you to stay inside your house with your doors locked. This is going to be visible in your neighborhood, and you don't want to be outside when it happens. I thanked him and hung up the phone. Then I found Marcus and brought him inside, made sure all the doors were locked, and we sat in the living room watching the clock count down to 2 p.m. At exactly 2:15 p.m., I heard the first sirens. 2 minutes later, federal vehicles had cordoned off the street in both directions. FBI agents in windbreakers began moving into Mark Richardson's pristine white mansion, and I watched from my window as they escorted him out in handcuffs. Mark's white Mercedes was still in the driveway, and his wife Sharon was standing on the porch, screaming. Their teenage daughter looked like her world had just ended. I felt no triumph, no vindication, no satisfaction. I felt only exhaustion. This was what justice looked like. A corrupt man arrested, his family traumatized, his life destroyed. It was necessary, but it wasn't cathartic.
The federal case moved faster than anyone expected. Mark's lawyer tried to delay the trial, filed motions to suppress evidence, claimed that FBI investigators had overstepped their authority. None of it worked. Federal judges have zero tolerance for embezzlers who steal from elderly residents and working-class families. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Here are the financial records. Here is the shell company. Here is the embezzlement. Here is the evidence that Mark used the stolen money to finance unauthorized development projects that violated community deed restrictions. Mark's defense was that the money he'd stolen was actually a reinvestment in community improvements. The judge responded by noting that investing stolen money doesn't transform it into legitimate funds. Stealing $340,000 is still stealing, even if you claim you intended to use the money for purposes that might have benefited the community. The jury took 45 minutes to deliberate before convicting Mark on all counts. He received 4 years federal prison, a $500,000 fine, and $450,000 in court-ordered restitution to the community. But here's what changed everything. The federal court didn't just prosecute Mark for his crimes. The court also ordered him to unwind and remediate all unauthorized development projects. This legal language meant that every unauthorized construction project Mark had started had to be stopped. Every violation of deed restrictions had to be corrected. Every illegal structure had to be removed. And on my property specifically, it meant that the destruction of my son's therapeutic garden had to be restored. Mark had wanted to transform Pinewood Valley into a commercial development. Instead, he'd guaranteed that Pinewood Valley would be restored to its original residential character. The development project he'd started was torn down. The zoning violations were corrected. The deed restrictions were reinforced. And the therapeutic garden that he'd destroyed was going to be rebuilt, not by the HOA, not by contractors, but by me and my son, with the full legal backing of federal court order. When I told Marcus what had happened, that we could rebuild the garden, that the bad man was going to jail, that he couldn't hurt us anymore, my son put his arms around me and cried. Not sad tears, relief tears. The kind of tears that come when a weight you've been carrying finally gets set down. "Dad," Marcus said, "does this mean the roses come back?" Rebecca's favorite roses, which I'd removed before the bulldozing to save them. "The roses come back," I confirmed. I didn't hire professional contractors to rebuild Marcus's garden. I did it myself, with Marcus helping, on weekends and after work. This time, I did it right. I bought professional-grade irrigation systems, so the plants wouldn't depend on erratic watering. I installed native plants selected by the county extension office specifically for their therapeutic sensory properties. I built the pathways with river stones arranged in patterns that would encourage Marcus to trace them with his fingers. I created different texture stations where he could touch different materials: smooth river stones, rough bark, soft moss, cool metal wind chimes. Every detail was documented, photographed, and certified by the county as compliant with all applicable regulations and deed restrictions.
The most meaningful part was planting new David Austin roses in the section where the old ones had been bulldozed. Rebecca's favorite roses would grow again, and Marcus helped me plant each one. He remembered the varieties she'd loved: William Morris roses, Gertrude Jekyll roses, Lady of Shalott. As he helped dig the holes and position each plant, Marcus talked about his mother in a way I hadn't heard since her death. He remembered how she used to smell the roses every morning. He remembered how she would sit in the garden in the afternoon. He remembered that she loved that place. Building that garden was therapeutic for both of us, but especially for Marcus. Returning to a broken place and making it beautiful again. Restoring something that had been destroyed. Working toward healing instead of just surviving. It took 3 months of weekends, and when we finally finished, I took Marcus out there on a Saturday morning at sunrise, just like Rebecca used to do. The garden smelled like jasmine and lavender and roses. The wind chimes created gentle sounds in the breeze. The pathways were perfect for wandering, and my son, who'd overcome trauma and loss and social destruction, stood in that garden and said, "Mom would be proud of this." The Pinewood Valley HOA dissolved completely. Federal investigators discovered that Mark had corrupted the entire board, either through knowledge of his embezzlement or through intimidation and social pressure. A special court-appointed administrator took control of community finances and hired forensic accountants to determine exactly how much money had been stolen and how to distribute it to residents. Every single family in Pinewood Valley received restitution checks. Families who'd been bullied by Mark received additional compensation. The community held a meeting to dissolve the old HOA and elect a new leadership structure dedicated to maintaining Pinewood Valley as a residential neighborhood with transparent finances and honest governance. They asked me to serve as treasurer for the new HOA, responsible for managing finances with absolute transparency. I almost declined because I wanted nothing more to do with community politics. But then I realized that my accepting the position would send a message to every resident. The person who fought the corruption and exposed the fraud was now entrusted with protecting community finances. That message mattered. It said that truth-telling was rewarded, that integrity was valued, that the community was willing to evolve beyond what Mark Richardson had created. The restoration extended beyond just the garden. Patricia Wong, the board secretary who Mark had pressured into signing false financial statements, filed her own lawsuit against him for coercion and duress. She received a $25,000 settlement. 11 families who'd been directly pressured by Mark filed a class action suit and split a $95,000 settlement. My own lawsuit against Mark for the destruction of property and intentional infliction of emotional distress resulted in an additional $50,000 award that I directed to an autism support organization in Rebecca's name. 6 months after Mark's conviction, I was driving my electrical truck through Pinewood Valley and noticed that the lot where Mark had begun his unauthorized commercial development was being cleared. The partial structures were being demolished. The deed restrictions were being restored. The neighborhood was returning to what it had always been designed to be, a residential community where families could build lives and create meaning without wealthy developers exploiting them for profit. I met with Special Agent Kenneth Moore one final time. He explained that Mark's case had become a template for how federal authorities investigate HOA fraud. Agents throughout the Southeast had begun looking more carefully at embezzlement in homeowners associations. Prosecutors had started training on how to recognize these patterns. Mark Richardson, in trying to build a criminal empire through corruption and intimidation, had actually created precedent that would protect thousands of people in future HOA disputes. Marcus started high school the next year and joined the environmental club. He spent his weekends helping to restore native plants in a local wetland area, turning his personal trauma into community service. His selective mutism, which had silenced him for months after Rebecca's death, had been completely overcome. He spoke in front of school assemblies about environmental protection. He gave presentations about therapeutic gardens and sensory restoration. He became exactly what Rebecca had hoped he would be, a person who turned tragedy into purpose. My electrical contracting business expanded significantly. Residents throughout the county who'd heard about my stand against Mark began calling for my services specifically because they knew I was trustworthy and committed to integrity. I hired 3 additional electricians and established a scholarship program for vocational students.
funded by my profits. I wanted kids from working-class families to know that you didn't have to be wealthy or have an MBA to overcome corruption and injustice. The most meaningful moment came exactly 1 year after Mark's arrest. Marcus and I were sitting in his rebuilt therapeutic garden on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee, well, Marcus was drinking hot chocolate, and watching the sun rise over the jasmine vines. The garden was more beautiful than it had ever been. The roses bloomed more vibrantly than they had when Rebecca was alive. The air smelled like jasmine and hope and restoration. Marcus turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think Mom can see this from heaven?" I told him I absolutely believed that Rebecca could see it, that she would be proud of what we'd built together, that her memory was honored by this garden more than any monument could honor it. And Marcus smiled, the kind of genuine smile that comes from someone who's survived impossible circumstances and discovered that life can still be beautiful. Mark Richardson is now serving his 4th year in federal prison in North Carolina. Sharon was never charged, though she was ordered to return the money her shell company received. Their mansion was sold to a young family who treats Pinewood Valley as what it was always meant to be, a neighborhood of equals, not a hierarchy of exploiters and victims, and Pinewood Valley Estates, the community that almost became a monument to one man's corruption, remains exactly what it was designed to be, a peaceful residential neighborhood where working families can raise their children, create gardens, build memories, and know that their community is protected by transparency, integrity, and the knowledge that ordinary people will stand up against extraordinary corruption. That's the real victory. Not punishment, but prevention. Not revenge, but restoration. Not destruction, but healing. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.